Following opening remarks will be from the DTSC Acting Deputy Director for Hazardous Waste Management Program, Rizgar Ghazi, hope I said his name right, and Jessica Twinning and Ed Benelli will give an overview of the CTMSR regulations. Then throughout the remaining time, we want to hear your ideas or how DTSC should develop these regulations further. This workshop and the following comment periods provides the opportunity for the public to participate and to provide input and feedback in DTSC's rulemaking. We request that you hold your comments until after the presentation. Also, when you speak following the presentation, please state your name and your affiliation. We have this room reserved until 4 p.m. Now, I'd like to introduce Jessica Twinning.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not Rizgar Ghazi. He'll be back, or he'll be here shortly. But welcome. My name is Jessica Twining. I'm the Chief of the Policy Development Unit at the Hazardous Waste Management Program with DTSC. I just want to thank you all for coming out today, and for those of you that are watching remotely, thank you for participating via webcast. DTSC greatly values your participation and feedback as we develop operating requirements and procedures for metal shredding facilities and the management of chemically treated metal shredder residue, or CTMSR. Our goal for this workshop and upcoming workshops is to have an open public process where all stakeholders can provide input on proposed management practices for this industry. As many of you are aware, DTSC recently completed an extensive analysis of metal shredding facilities and their processes, wastes, and potential impacts on human health and the environment, pursuant to Senate Bill 1249, or SB 1249, as it's commonly referred to. In January of this year, the results of those analyses were summarized in a draft report, which was posted on our website for public comment. DTSC is in the process of reviewing those comments and preparing the final version of the report, incorporating some of that feedback. DTSC understands the importance and benefits and services that the metal recycling sector provides to California. At the same time, we understand the potential impacts that these facilities can have on human health and the environment if the facilities and their waste are not properly managed. The primary goal of today's workshop is to get your feedback on the the draft regulation text that is going to be presented. Additional workshops are going to be planned to discuss the development of management practices for metal shredding facilities and to ensure the protection of public health and the environment. Some of the information from the draft analysis that was posted in January is going to be presented today to support the draft regulation text that's going to be presented. But I really want to make sure that we stay on track, so I'll ask that today's commenters focus their comments and feedback on just the draft regulation text, so that we can have a more smooth meeting. If you're participating via the webcast, you can submit your comments to the MSW stakeholders mailbox that Veronica mentioned. Again, it's mswstakeholders@dtsc.ca.gov. And I'll be monitoring that mailbox throughout the workshop just to make sure we capture your comments and that we can make sure that your comments are heard. Additionally, just to reiterate what Veronica said, we'll accept comments for the next 30 days, with the comment period closing Wednesday, July 25th. This allows stakeholders time to process the information that's presented and still provide comments if you don't do so today. Again, I want to reiterate that there's additional workshops being held this summer regarding more detailed aspects of the proposed management of shredding facilities. Due to the focus of today's workshop on just the draft regulation text, we may defer some of your comments to those later workshops if they're outside of the scope of today's meeting. Again, I want to thank you all for coming. And up next is Ed Benelli.
Let me put this up here so you can hear me. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Jessica. We'll get started on the presentation. We'll probably go about 40, 45 minutes. Then we'll take a little break. I think Jessica will come up and give some closing remarks following the presentation. We'll take a little break for a few minutes, and then after that, we'll reconvene and take comments from the audience. So probably about 40, 45 minutes. So good afternoon. If you don't know me, my name is Ed Benelli. I'm a hazardous substance engineer in the Policy Development Unit in the Policy and Program Support Branch within the Department of Toxic Substance Control's Hazardous Waste Management Program. The purpose of this presentation is to describe DTSC's proposed regulations to establish a conditional exclusion for chemically treated metal shredder residue. DTSC is holding this informal public workshop to explain the proposed rule to the public, to the regulated community, and to other stakeholders in order to solicit preliminary input on the proposed rule. This informal workshop is being held as a pre-APA public workshop before the formal rulemaking begins under the Administrative Procedure Act. See if we can figure out how to do it here. So for today's agenda and today's meeting, we'll provide an introduction and background of metal shredding facilities and metal shredder waste. We'll review findings from DTSC's draft evaluation of metal shredding facilities and metal shredder waste. We'll review the proposed regulatory language for the conditional exclusion for chemically treated metal shredder residue. We'll review how the public can participate in the rulemaking process under the Administrative Procedure Act. We'll then follow up with comments where the public can provide input. I always start with what's a metal shredding facility for folks that haven't been to one. First, what's a metal shredding facility? A metal shredding facility is defined in statute as an operation that uses a shredding technique to process end-of-life vehicles, appliances, and other forms of scrap metal to facilitate the separation and sorting of ferrous metals, non-ferrous metals, and other recyclable materials from non-recyclable materials that are components of the end-of-life vehicles, appliances, and other forms of scrap metal. A metal shredding facility does not include a feeder yard, a metal crusher, or a metal baler if that facility does not otherwise conduct metal shredding operations. Why did DTSC undertake this review of metal shredding facilities and metal shredder waste? In 1984, California established the waste extraction test. Metal shredder waste was determined to be a California-only non-RCRA hazardous waste because it generally exceeded the soluble threshold limit concentrations for lead, cadmium, and zinc, and the total threshold limit concentrations for copper, lead, and zinc. You're late. Industry and DTSC then developed a treatment method that used chemical stabilization to reduce the solubility of metals, which lowered the potential for metals to leach from the waste. In 1985, the legislature directed the water boards to designate landfills that were authorized to accept metal shredder waste. Following direction from the legislature, in 1987, the Water Board adopted Resolution 87-22, which allowed metal shredder waste that was treated by chemical stabilization to be disposed in municipal solid waste landfills. Later, DTSC classified metal shredder waste that was treated by chemical stabilization to be a non-hazardous waste. These classifications are commonly referred to as F letters. In 2015, SB 1249 was enacted, which directed DTSC to reevaluate its past management decisions. In January of 2018, DTSC issued its draft evaluation and analysis of metal shredding facilities and metal shredder waste. What do metal shredding facilities do? Metal shredding facilities process automobiles, appliances, other forms of scrap metal for the purposes of recycling. A hammer mill is used to shred the scrap metal. Ferrous metals are then recovered using magnets. Non-ferrous metals are separated based on differences in physical properties such as size, magnetism, or density. The remaining waste is called metal shredder residue, or MSR. Finally, chemical stabilization is used to treat the MSR, and the treated material is referred to as chemically treated metal shredder residue, or CTMSR. This slide shows how much metal is recovered from a typical scrap vehicle. Ferrous metals such as iron and steel make up 3/4 of the initial weight on average. Non-ferrous metals, such as copper and aluminum, make up a smaller percentage. Nearly 1/4 of the weight of a typical automobile remains as waste after all the metals have been recovered. Metal shredder residue, or MSR, is the waste material that remains after all the valuable metals have been separated from the shredded automobiles, appliances, and other forms of scrap metal. Historically, metal shredder residue has also been called auto shredder waste, auto shredder residue, or auto shredder fluff. MSR is contaminated with metals such as lead, cadmium, copper, and zinc, which are present from the shredding of the scrap metals. This graphic shows the current authority for the disposal of chemically treated metal shredder residue. In the lower right-hand corner, the historic F letters classify the chemically treated metal shredder residue as non-hazardous waste. The non-hazardous waste classification governs the storage, transportation, and disposal of the waste. Thus, the F letters allow chemically treated metal shredder residue to be disposed as non-hazardous waste. The proposed regulation addresses only this portion of the overall metal shredding processes. In January of 2018, DTSC released its draft report. DTSC's report identified these major metal shredding facilities operating in California and the landfills where metal shredder waste is disposed. These facilities and landfills were the subject of DTSC's evaluation and analysis. This slide shows how much CTMSR was produced in recent years compared to California-generated hazardous waste. CTMSR is often used as alternative daily cover in municipal solid waste landfills. The amount of CTMSR used as ADC is shown in red. Approximately 477,000 tons of CTMSR was used as ADC at municipal landfills in 2015. The amount of California-generated hazardous waste is shown in blue. For comparison purposes, the amount of CTMSR generated each year equals 50% or more of the hazardous waste generated and disposed in California. What subjects are covered in DTSC's draft evaluation and analysis of metal shredding facilities? Prior to 2015, DTSC had been working with metal shredders to develop a treatability study to demonstrate the highest level of treatment to reduce the solubility of metal contaminants that could be achieved with the current chemical stabilization technology. In 2015, the treatability study was incorporated into DTSC's implementation of SB 1249. In the report, DTSC evaluated the hazardous waste management activities that are subject to existing hazardous waste control law. The report includes the results of the treatability study, as well as additional testing that DTSC used to determine the potential for off-site migration of contaminants through the air from landfills that accept CTMSR. DTSC released its draft report for public comment in January of 2018. A significant portion of DTSC's evaluation of the management of metal shredder waste involved a treatability study. The treatability study was designed to answer three questions. Does the waste exhibit a federal RCRA hazardous waste characteristic? To what degree does the waste exhibit a California-only non-RCRA hazardous waste characteristic? And lastly, what is the highest level of treatment that can be achieved with the current technology? The best treatment, or the optimum application rate, is the application rate which achieved the greatest reduction in metal solubility. The treatability study was designed so that the results could be used to determine the most appropriate disposal options for this waste. In order to answer the first question, does the waste exhibit a RCRA hazardous waste characteristic, samples were collected from each facility conducting the chemical stabilization treatment. Each sample collected during the treatability study was split so that portions could be analyzed by both industry and also by DTSC's environmental chemistry laboratory. DTSC's ECL laboratory first performed the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure to determine whether the treated waste exhibited a hazardous waste characteristic under the federal law. DTSC does not have the authority to classify a federal RCRA waste as non-hazardous. This table shows the results of DTSC's testing of the samples before and after for the federal test, the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure, after treatment at the optimum rate or best treatment. Samples of untreated waste were collected upstream of the pug mill. These samples show the characteristics of waste before chemical treatment. Additional samples were collected downstream of the pug mill. The difference between these samples shows the efficacy of the treatment process. When tested by the TCLP, the treatability study showed that the waste does not exceed federal hazardous waste limits for the constituents most commonly associated with metal shredder residue. Thus, the waste was not shown to be a RCRA waste under the federal system. In order to answer the second question, to what degree does the waste exhibit California-only non-RCRA hazardous waste characteristics, samples were then analyzed by the waste extraction test. The wet test is used to determine the total threshold limit concentrations and the soluble threshold limit concentrations to show whether the treated waste exhibited a hazardous waste characteristic under California law. The TTLC and STLC results were used to determine if the waste is a California-only non-RCRA waste. The wet test is more stringent than the federal test because more contaminants are identified in the wet test than in the federal TCLP procedure. DTSC's laboratory performed the California waste extraction test on the metal shredder residue samples to determine the TTLC and the STLC limit concentrations. This table shows the results for metal shredder residue treated at the optimum application rate, or best treatment. These results show that untreated metal shredder residue exceeded regulatory thresholds for both total and soluble metals under the California testing procedure. These results also show that after treatment, the treated CTMSR still exceeded regulatory thresholds for TTLC for copper and zinc and STLC for lead and zinc. Thus, even after treatment at the most effective rate, CTMSR remains a California-only, non-RCRA hazardous waste. DTSC also conducted an assessment of waste management at landfills receiving CTMSR. DTSC's assessment included a review of each facility's waste discharge requirements, which govern the landfill's acceptance policies and operations. DTSC reviewed the locations of nearby sensitive receptors. DTSC conducted air sampling at several landfills that receive metal shredder residue. DTSC reviewed the surface water data collected from the receiving landfills. And DTSC reviewed the leachate data collected from receiving landfills. 22 landfills are now authorized by the Regional Water Quality Control Boards to accept CTMSR. 5 landfills currently accept the material. Most CTMSR accepted by landfills is used as alternative daily cover. Alternative daily cover is recognized to be a form of beneficial reuse. ADC is any non-earthen material that is placed on the active face of a municipal solid waste landfill at the end of each operating day to control vectors, fires, odors, blowing litter, and scavenging. CTMSR replaces the use of clean soils for daily cover. CTMSR makes up approximately 15% of all ADC used statewide. CTMSR is approved for use as ADC by CalRecycle and by the waste discharge requirements issued to each landfill by the Regional Water Quality Control Boards. DTSC collected air samples to determine the potential for particulate matter to migrate from the landfills. The air sampling was conducted at Vasco Road Landfill and at Simi Valley Landfill between August and September of 2017. Air samples were collected for total suspended particulates, TSP, particulate matter smaller than 10 microns, PM10, and PM2.5. The collected particulate matter samples were further analyzed for metals, including for lead. The larger particle sizes are not expected to travel long distances before dropping out of the air. Smaller particles have the potential to travel greater distances. You're a little late, but I'm glad you made it. Samples from both landfills frequently exceeded the annual or 24-hour ambient air quality standards for PM10 or PM2.5. This is likely due to dust created by heavy machinery working at the sites. Because lead is a major contaminant of concern, the concentration of lead in the samples was compared to the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for lead, to the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health recommended exposure limits for lead, and to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration permissible exposure limits for lead. The highest concentration of lead at either landfill was below the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for lead. The highest concentration of lead at either landfill was also below the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health recommended exposure limits for lead. And the highest concentration of lead at either landfill was below the Occupational Safety and Health Administration permissible exposure limits for lead. Based on DTSC's review of the air monitoring data from the landfills, DTSC does not expect CTMSR or contaminants commonly found in CTMSR to migrate off-site at a landfill via the pathway of windborne particulate dispersion. DTSC reviewed stormwater sampling data from landfills that accept CTMSR to see if there was an indication that the material was migrating from landfills via the pathway of surface water. DTSC reviewed stormwater runoff sampling data in the State Water Resources Control Board's Stormwater Multiple Application and Reporting Tracking System, the SMARTS database. The SMARTS database stores information from monitoring data required for the landfill's permits. This comparison of results for lead and zinc concentrations in stormwater runoff from Simi Valley, which accepts CTMSR, and from Sunshine Canyon, which does not accept CTMSR, shows that soluble metals are not greater in runoff from the landfill that accepts CTMSR. DTSC also reviewed leachate sample data from landfills that accepted CTMSR to see if there was an indication that the material was migrating from the landfills via the pathway of groundwater. DTSC reviewed leachate data for landfills in the State Water Resources Control Board's GeoTracker database. The GeoTracker database stores information on sites that have the potential to impact groundwater. This comparison of results for lead and zinc in landfill leachate from Vasco Road Landfill, which accepts CTMSR, and from Ox Mountain Landfill, which does not accept CTMSR, shows that in some cases, soluble metal concentrations can be greater in leachate from landfills that do not accept CTMSR. Thus, these comparisons of the concentrations of soluble metals in leachate from landfills that accept CTMSR and those that do not accept CTMSR do not indicate that the metals in CTMSR are solubilizing and migrating in the municipal solid waste landfills. In DTSC's draft report, DTSC made the following findings and determination regarding the disposal of CTMSR at landfills. DTSC conducted a treatability study to establish the highest level of treatment that could be achieved with the current technology. DTSC conducted air sampling at the landfills to determine the potential for contaminants in the waste to migrate from the facilities following disposal, and evaluated the potential for contaminants to migrate from the landfills through leachate and surface water runoff. The draft report concluded that disposal of chemically treated metal shredder residue as non-hazardous waste in municipal solid waste landfills, including its use as alternative daily cover, has not resulted in harm to human health or safety or to the environment. Based on this analysis, DTSC has chosen to promulgate regulations to classify CTMSR as non-hazardous waste and allow, with additional protective conditions, its continued disposal in authorized landfills. Why is this regulation needed? Since the 1980s, CTMSR has been granted non-hazardous waste classification and has been disposed in municipal solid waste landfills and used as alternative daily cover. DTSC's analysis demonstrated that continued disposal of CTMSR as non-hazardous waste in municipal solid waste landfills, including its use as alternative daily cover, has not resulted in harm to human health or safety or to the environment. However, DTSC has determined that the non-hazardous waste classifications established under the authority of the F letters are no longer the most appropriate or effective mechanism for the management of CTMSR. Rather, DTSC has determined that it is more appropriate and effective to establish an exclusion from CTMSR from hazardous waste management requirements under a new regulation that places additional specified requirements as conditions to the exclusion. DTSC is proposing these new regulations to add safeguards that will provide enhanced protection for human health, safety, and the environment. Adoption of these standards and regulation will allow DTSC to implement and enforce the requirements of California hazardous waste law more consistently and effectively. Thus, DTSC is proposing to replace the current requirements for the management of this waste with new conditions in these regulations that will provide enhanced protection for human health, safety, and the environment. In summary, the proposed exclusion for chemically treated metal shredder residue allows CTMSR to be managed as non-hazardous waste only if it is generated by a metal shredding facility that is authorized by the department, only if it is treated at the most effective rate demonstrated in the Treatability Study, and only if it is disposed at authorized landfills approved to accept the waste by the regional waste water quality control boards. In the next section of the presentation, we'll go in detail over the proposed regulations. We'll go paragraph by paragraph, so you can have the regulations and read along. We will next go over the specific language in the proposed regulations. The first part of the proposed regulatory language includes the addition of several new definitions. The first definition is for an authorized metal shredding facility. The proposed regulation establishes three types of authorizations. An authorized metal shredding facility means a metal shredding facility that is authorized to treat and store hazardous waste using one of the following authorities: a permit issued by the department that authorizes operations of a metal shredding facility, an order issued or entered into by the department that authorizes the metal shredding facility to continue operations subject to specified management and operating conditions, or a judgment issued by a court with a jurisdiction over a matter to which the department and the metal shredding facility are parties that authorizes operations subject to specific management and operating conditions. This will prevent any facility that is not closely monitored by a regulatory agency from taking advantage of this exclusion. This would include mobile shredders or other non-authorized operations. The next definition is for an authorized solid waste landfill unit. This definition is based on paragraph J of section 25150.82 of the California Health and Safety Code. This definition establishes that an authorized solid waste landfill unit means a composite line portion of a solid waste landfill unit that meets all the requirements applicable to disposal of municipal solid waste in California and that is regulated by waste discharge requirements issued under the Water Code. The discharge of chemically treated metal shredder residue includes its use as alternative daily cover or for other beneficial reuse pursuant to section 41781.3 of the Public Resource Code and regulations adopted to implement that section. This will prevent the waste from being deposited in any location other than the most appropriate landfills that have been approved for the acceptance of this waste by the Regional Water Quality Control Boards. These landfills are closely monitored by the Regional Water Quality Control Boards for such things as leachate and surface water runoff. This definition makes clear that CTMSR discharged to an authorized solid waste landfill unit may be used as alternative daily cover or for other beneficial uses. The next definition is for chemical stabilization. This definition is based on paragraph 4A of section 67450.11 of the California Code of Regulations. This definition establishes that chemical stabilization means a process by which waste is converted to a more chemically stable form that reduces the solubility of the contaminants through the addition of liquid sodium or potassium polysilicate solution in Portland cement or lime. This definition is necessary to ensure that CTMSR is treated by the chemical stabilization method that was demonstrated to be effective in the treatability study. The next definition is for chemically treated metal shredder residue. This definition establishes that chemically treated metal shredder residue, or CTMSR, means the portion of metal shredder residue that remains after metals are removed following the shredding of end-of-life vehicles, appliances, or other forms of scrap metal, and consists of, but is not limited to, plastics, rubber, glass, foam, fabrics, carpeting, residual automobile fluids, incidental dirt, and unrecoverable metals, and that has been treated using chemical stabilization as defined in this section. Chemically treated metal shredder residue also includes and may be alternatively referred to as treated auto shredder waste or treated metal shredder waste, provided that the waste described by these terms meets the above definition of chemically treated metal shredder residue. These additional definitions are necessary to avoid conflicting with existing language found in other permits and regulations that have been issued by other regulatory agencies. As an example, none of the existing waste discharge requirements which allow authorized landfills to accept CTMSR should have to be modified because DTSC is adopting this new definition. This is the last definition added to Chapter 10. This definition is for a metal shredding facility. This definition references paragraph B of section 25150.82 of the California Health and Safety Code. This is the definition for metal shredding facility found in or established by SB 1249. This definition is necessary to define the scope and applicability of the regulation. We will next move to the conditional exclusion established in Chapter 11. Subsection I is added to Section 66261.4 to read, CTMSR is not hazardous waste for the purposes of transportation and disposal, provided the chemically treated metal shredder residue is generated by an authorized metal shredding facility. This provision ensures that only CTMSR that is generated by an authorized metal shredding facility is eligible for this exclusion. Next, CTMSR is not hazardous waste for the purposes of transportation to disposal, provided that has been treated by chemical stabilization using a minimum application rate of 0.7 gallons of liquid sodium or potassium silicate solution per ton of metal shredder residue and 12% by weight of Portland cement or lime. This provision ensures that CTMSR is treated at the most effective application rate prior to disposal. This is the application rate which was determined through the treatability study to achieve the maximum reduction in the solubility of contaminants. The next section added is B. B reads, the CTMSR may also be treated by hazardous waste environmental technology that has been certified by the director to achieve an equivalent or greater reduction of soluble metals than the chemical stabilization required by subparagraph 2A. An authorized metal shredding facility or its representative may petition the director for an evaluation and determination of the hazardous waste environmental technology. The evaluation and determination of the hazardous waste environmental technology shall be conducted pursuant to the requirements of Chapter 46, commencing with Section 68,000. The petitioner shall be responsible for, and the department shall recover, all costs for evaluating the hazardous waste environmental technology. A hazardous waste environmental technology shall be deemed to be an accepted treatment method only after certification by the director that the method achieves an equivalent or greater reduction of soluble metals than the chemical stabilization required by subparagraph 2A. This provision ensures that a metal shredding facility is allowed to develop new and improved treatment methods, and that a facility can substitute a new method once it is certified by the director. Additionally, CTMSR is not hazardous waste for the purposes of transportation and disposal, provided the CTMSR does not exhibit the requisite hazardous waste characteristic of toxicity, provided the CTMSR is identified as a non-requisite hazardous waste solely because it exhibits the characteristics of toxicity by exceeding the total threshold limit concentration for metals or the soluble threshold limit concentration for metals. The CTMSR does not exhibit any other characteristics of hazardous waste specified in Article 3 of this chapter. These provisions ensure that CTMSR must not be a federal requisite waste and may only be a California-only non-requisite waste because it exceeds state regulatory thresholds for metals. These provisions will further ensure that CTMSR contains no mercury or PCBs prior to disposal. Metal shredding facilities are required to remove any components containing these contaminants prior to shredding the scrap metal. We're up to Section 6. We're only going to 9, so we're getting there. Next, CTMSR is not hazardous waste for the purposes of transportation and disposal, provided the CTMSR is stored prior to transportation in compliance with all applicable requirements found in Chapter 14 for the storage of hazardous waste in containers, tanks, or containment buildings. CTMSR that is released into the environment is not eligible for this exclusion unless it is immediately and fully recovered and contained to prevent further release into the environment. This provision ensures that prior to transportation and disposal, CTMSR is stored as a hazardous waste while on site. This is the same storage requirement as for excluded recyclable materials. Next, CTMSR is not a hazardous waste for the purposes of transportation and disposal, provided that the CTMSR is transported by the same authorized metal shredding facility that generated the CTMSR, and all of the following conditions are met. The CTMSR is transported by employees of that authorized metal shredding facility and in vehicles under the control of that authorized metal shredding facility, or it is transported on behalf of that authorized metal shredding facility by a hazardous waste hauler registered with the department. The CTMSR is not handled at any interim location prior to disposal, and the CTMSR is not held at any publicly accessible interim location for more than 4 hours unless required by other provisions of law prior to disposal. These provisions ensure that CTMSR is not allowed to be further processed or stored at any interim location, and that is transported directly to an authorized landfill. Next, CTMSR is not hazardous waste for the purposes of transportation and disposal, provided the CTMSR is disposed to an authorized solid waste landfill unit. This condition ensures that CTMSR is only disposed to an authorized landfill unit. We're almost finished here. And CTMSR is not hazardous waste for the purposes of disposal and transportation, provided the authorized metal shredding facility maintains at its facility and provides to the department or other regulatory agency upon request all of the following documentation: a record of the amount of liquid sodium and potassium polysilicate solution in Portland cement or lime used to treat the metal shredder residue, which demonstrates by mass balance that the minimum application rate required by paragraph 2 has been achieved, or as necessary to demonstrate compliance with any limitations or operating requirements established pursuant to paragraph 2B. These conditions ensure that the facility can demonstrate compliance with the requirements for the chemical stabilization treatment found in the exclusion, and that inspectors from DTSC and other regulatory agencies can determine compliance with those requirements. CTMSR is not a hazardous waste for the purposes of transportation and disposal, provided the authorized metal shredding facility maintains at its facility a record of the date of each shipment of CTMSR, the quantity in tons of CTMSR in each shipment, and the name and address of the authorized solid waste landfill that receives each shipment of CTMSR. These conditions ensure that the facility can demonstrate compliance with the requirements for transportation and disposal of CTMSR found in the exclusion, and then inspectors from DTSC and other regulatory agencies can determine compliance with those requirements. Lastly, CTMSR is not a hazardous waste for the purposes of transportation and disposal, provided that the metal shredding facility maintains a record of monthly sampling and analysis of CTMSR, which demonstrates that the CTMSR meets the conditions required by paragraphs 3 and 4. This monthly sampling and analysis of CTMSR must meet the following requirements. The sampling shall be conducted in accordance with the procedures established in the test methods for evaluating solid waste, US EPA publication SW 846, and the analysis of CTMSR shall verify that the concentration of the metals listed in the Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations do not exceed the regulatory level when determined by the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure. This provision ensures that CTMSR is sampled and analyzed according to established and accepted protocols. The TCLP analysis verifies that CTMSR is not a federal RCRA waste. In addition, because mercury is included in the TCLP analysis, this provision ensures that CTMSR does not contain mercury. CTMSR is not a hazardous waste, provided the metal shredding facility maintains records of the analysis of CTMSR that verify that the concentration of polychlorinated biphenyls does not exceed the total threshold limit concentration or the soluble threshold limit concentration when determined by the waste extraction test procedure. This provision ensures that CTMSR does not contain polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs. A few slides on how the public and other stakeholders can participate in the department's rulemaking moving forward. The public's right to participate in the rulemaking process is established by the Administrative Procedure Act. The Office of Administrative Law is responsible for ensuring that California state agencies comply with the rulemaking procedures and standards set forth in California's Administrative Procedure Act. When adopting regulations, all California state agencies must follow the rulemaking procedures in the APA and regulations adopted by the Office of Administrative Law. Today's informal workshop is being held as a pre-APA public workshop before the formal rulemaking begins under the Administrative Procedure Act. DTSC anticipates issuing the Notice of Proposed Action and beginning the formal rulemaking process in the fall of 2018. A public hearing would then be held in late fall of 2018, and the proposed regulations would become effective in July of 2019 if approved by the Office of Administrative Law. The Office of Administrative Law provides several guides to assist the public and other stakeholders in how to participate in the rulemaking process. The regular rulemaking process includes comprehensive public notice and comment requirements. It also requires that documents and information on which the rulemaking action is based are available for review and inspection. Information on the public participation in the rulemaking process can be found on the Office of Administrative Law webpage at oal.ca.gov. Additionally, DTSC posts all information regarding its proposed regulations at DTSC/laws, regs, policies. Okay, we're almost finished here. Contact information, additional sources of information. We do maintain a project webpage with quite a bit of information on it. I mentioned DTSC's regulations under development. You'll find the notice for today's workshop there, and documents from today's workshop will be there as well. We also have an email to contact the metal shredder team. That's our MSW stakeholders at dtsc.ca.gov. And I would also encourage anybody who has not already signed up to our electronic listserv, please sign up to the listserv, which you can find a link to on our project homepage or on DTSC's list of DTSC's page of listservs. Please sign up for that listserv. That way you can be notified of upcoming activities that the department will be undertaking. And lastly, contact information for Jessica and myself, if you don't have it already. And I'll go back to this page so that people can have a chance to copy those email addresses down. That concludes the presentation on the information provided from the draft report and from the draft regulations. I think Jessica will come up and say a few comments. We'll basically wrap up here and take a break for a few minutes and come back maybe 10 or 15 minutes or something like that, and then we'll get started with taking your comments. So you're on.
Thanks, Ed. So basically, just to reiterate what Ed said, it's about 10 till. So I know this meeting is scheduled to go till 4, so let's take a 15-minute break, come back at 5 after 2, and then we'll start taking your comments. I'll just preface the comment period by saying, just so that we can capture everybody's comment and we have enough time, we're not going to necessarily respond to any questions or provide any feedback to you. We just want to take this opportunity to take your comments, make sure we have them all, and then we'll go back and look at them later. All right, so we'll see you in about 15 minutes.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so this is the comment portion of the workshop. So if you guys have anything that you want to suggest to us for this workshop and for the CTMSR workshop, that would be great. Just raise your hand and I'll come to you.
Somebody else is going to.
Yay! I think we need it just for
She's not
recording
shy.
it. So.
Okay, so most of you know me. My name is Meg Rose Gay, and I represent the coalition of shredding facilities that are discussed in the SB 1249 report. And we're going to be submitting extensive written comments. So our purpose here today is not really to lay out all of our questions and concerns and possible objections to the draft regulations, but just to pose a couple of questions, make a couple of kind of high-level points, pose a few questions. I take it we're not going to get any responses back from staff. It would be useful to get some feedback on some of these issues, but if we have to wait for a different time and place to have that discussion, that's certainly a discussion that we would like to have. So one of the first questions that we have relates to the getting some clarification around the issue of conditional exclusion versus declassification. So as you know, the F letters are a manifestation of the department's decision to declassify for all purposes treated shredder residue. And you said 10 or at least 100 times that under the new regime, the treated material would be considered non-hazardous for purposes of transportation and disposal. So that obviously raises significant concerns on our part as to the regulatory requirements that would apply prior to that time, and we don't understand, and our comments will address this in detail, but we don't understand why, in principle, given the findings of the report relative to the treated material, on what basis does the department determine that it is appropriate to impose additional regulations on the treated material prior to the time that it is transported to the landfill? For example, why would it be necessary to have the material transported to the landfill in a vehicle that is presumably owned by the shredding facility and has an employee that's driving the truck? That seems to be is just curious because the facilities use contract drivers. There's not a single incident that we're aware of spillage, damage, or other sort of incidents of harm along the way. So that would be an example of an unnecessary requirement. One of the major concerns that we have, I'll be candid with you, is this definition of authorized metal shredding facility. I mean, from your comments, Ed, it seemed that we could take from that it's intended to apply to the quote-unquote hazardous waste that is the subject of this rulemaking, i.e. the metal shredder residue and not the materials upstream of that?
I don't think that detail's in there. I don't think that detail's in there, so I wouldn't take anything from that.
Okay, so if from that comment, then I would take it that in order to enjoy the exclusion that you're setting forth, it's going to be necessary for the facilities to have some sort of a permit from the department with respect to the balance of their operations.
Well, that's the way that it reads now. It reads just the way it reads now. An authorized facility, there's various forms of authorization, but that's the way it reads now.
But it's the scope of that authorization that is the question that we have, not necessarily the form. That's a secondary issue. Another question is the definition of metal shredding facilities. You're taking it from the statute, but there are facilities in California that some of them don't use hammer mills and others of them do not shred autos. And we want to make sure that these regulations are going to apply to all metal shredding facilities, not just those who shred automobiles or a mix of light iron and automobiles using a hammer mill. I mean, if we're going to have a level playing field, we need to have a level playing field.
Probably the other ones are not conducting the chemical stabilization treatment. I'm not really sure about that, but I would assume any others you might be referring to would not be conducting the chemical stabilization treatment.
So they would be in, then all their shredder residue would be hazardous.
Waste. Yeah.
Well, what's the scope of it? That begs the question, though, Ed. If they do chemically treat their waste, are they covered by the regulations?
Oh, I think these are good questions, and get that in and let us chew on that. These are good questions. These are good. There might be something
So you
overlooked.
don't have an answer to that off the top?
No, we won't be able to give a lot of answers today. We don't have all of our staff here, and so today's workshop is to receive information from stakeholders, and so that's why we have a 30-day comment period. We want to give everybody a chance to think about this a lot, get your thoughts down on paper, get as many points as you can think of that are issues that we should focus on and address, and get those to us. We won't be able to give those answers today.
So we are definitely going to want to get clarification around this issue of, why does the department believe it's appropriate to impose additional management requirements on a material that the department itself has analyzed and determined does not pose a threat to human health and the environment and does not, even according to your own terminology, need to be quote unquote classified as a hazardous waste. I also wanted to take issue with the characterization of the treatability study that you've presented. That study, performed at great expense, I might add, looked at a range of treatment recipes, sort of baby bear, mama bear, and papa bear sort of an approach. So the purpose of the treatability study was not to determine the best level of treatment. It was to look at a range of recipes and determine in general the effectiveness of the chemical stabilization process that was used. So I believe that it's not accurate for the department to conclude that it's appropriate or necessary for any reason to increase the amount of treatment that is done on the materials. I mean, you've looked at the landfills in detail. There's nothing to indicate that there's a problem at the landfills based on the current level of treatment. And while there is a range in the level of treatment that these facilities are utilizing to require everybody to increase the amount of cement that is added to, and possibly the liquid chemical as well, but increasing the cement up to 12%, that doesn't represent the quote-unquote best level of treatment. It may achieve a higher percentage of lower solubility, but we could have, I mean, that number was almost randomly selected for purposes of the study. So we're very concerned about the implications of the department specifying a level of treatment, characterizing that level of treatment as the best or maximum level of treatment, and most importantly, we question what is gained by imposing these additional treatment requirements on the facilities. It's just going to unnecessarily increase costs when you've not demonstrated that there's any environmental reason in the real world to alter the treatment process that has been utilized for many, many, many years. So,
measured against environmental disbalances. Let her finish it. Balance that against environmental benefit.
yeah, and the point that's being made behind me is that, you know, having to haul tons and tons and tons of concrete around the state of California is going to result in several unintended consequences. More DPM coming out of heavy diesel machines, you know, filling up the landfills with, you know, cement unnecessarily consuming landfill capacity, which we all know is dear. The possibility that it will compromise the manageability of the ADC itself. I mean, the ADC that the facilities have been receiving and using very effectively as ADC for decades. They like it the way it is. And if we all of a sudden have to send them something that, you know, contains a significantly higher percentage of concrete, I just don't know if it, you know, if it will, and I don't know, has the department even considered the, you know, the environmental consequences of imposing increased treatment requirements for metal shredder residue. So.
Do you mind if I?
Yeah.
That's a really good question, Meg. So what we outlined is a proposal that we outlined for you folks to, we want your comments. However, the reg does have an alternative method for you to propose something for us, so what kind of treatment you want to do. So that's in there already as well. So it doesn't close you off into one process alone.
Yeah,
so
we're not trying to change the process.
Right.
It's just a question of the recipe.
give us your comments. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are important comments. I've actually heard those from other quarters, I believe, or heard that before, I think, from you. So that's an important consideration for us. I'd like to have your thoughts on that. I mean, how would you do it otherwise? How would you recommend to do it? Really, the facilities are all using a different rate or a different treatment currently, I believe, and have perhaps been historically. So I'd be interested in industry's ideas on how that could be codified.
Great, thank you. Good comments.
Chuck Helgett with Republic Services. I guess, I mean, I've looked through these regs very preliminarily at this point, so these, I wouldn't take these as criticisms, but more so as questions that are in the back of my mind that we'll probably be seeking additional feedback from you on at some point down the road. We're clearly pleased that as having had at least 2 or 3 of the facilities involved in the testing process, that you've found that it's appropriate for disposal. The material is going to be appropriate for disposal. It's not considered hazardous for disposal purposes, and verified its use as alternative daily cover. Obviously, you know, we're pleased with those findings, but not to be redundant, but to be redundant. Echoing some of Meg's concerns, and we're going to look very closely at the stabilization process. I'm not sure at this point what the 12% cement will do from an ADC perspective. I do think that this is a weight issue that sometimes concern us, particularly with the trucks. On the other hand, I also not clearly understanding why you have the requirement in there for material that, when it's leaving the facility, is considered non-hazardous, but yet requiring that the hauler be either the generator or a registered hazardous waste hauler. So that's definitely a question from our perspective. And the question of declassification, Ed, we've talked about this over the years, I guess, is that we've been taking this material. So throughout this process, whatever the declassification process is, or however it's going to be classified, we have legacy material in our landfills, and we're very concerned about what that could mean looking back as well as going forward. So I think those are some of our preliminary and major concerns.
I've seen someone else with their hand raised. Oh, great. No, perfect.
Just with respect to the answers that aren't coming today, we're going to gather the comments and concerns. Will there be a venue to see those comments and questions and then see the answers that were provided?
Did you say video? So this presentation today will be on the EPA website. So this presentation and the comments will be on the EPA website, so you can rewatch it.
So I'm asking specific to the unanswered questions at some point down the road.
I think we have not made a decision yet whether we will publish the comments or not. It's not required. We're in the pre-APA process. If we were in the formal rulemaking process, it would be required to publish the comments. So I just can't give you an answer on when those would be available. It would be past the 30-day mark at the soonest.
So we won't know what all the questions are or the answers, ever.
Yeah, I really can't make a commitment to that.
What did you want? What did you want? You wanted the comments public? We can provide the comments. It's being recorded, so we can provide that to you.
He's more interested in the answers.
Well, the intent is to hear your comments based on what we propose here, and hopefully we can take those comments and make revisions to the outline that we have in the rec text, and that should reflect in the rec text itself. And the ISO should have some description of what we did and why we did it as well.
No, definitely.
So Ed, you made a comment that the storage requirements that would apply prior to the removal of the treated material to the landfill, that those are the same as the requirements that apply to ERM?
Which is
in
hazardous.
Tanks, containers, or containment buildings. And I think your own experience, Rizgar, in seeing some of the operations, you know what our concerns are with the quote-unquote containment building. But I would also take issue with the statement, and we'll explain this in our comments, but it depends on the exemption, or excuse me, the exclusion that you're relying on, what the storage requirements are. So one of the exclusions that is relied upon unnecessarily, in my opinion, by one of the shredders does refer back to the interim status storage requirements. The other exclusions, which are applicable, at least under one legal theory, do not incorporate by reference the hazardous waste storage requirements. It's the local hazardous materials storage ordinances that are the conditions that attach to those exclusions that apply to recyclers that are recycling non-RCRA hazardous materials on site. So just, we'll lay this out in our comments so you get it, but containment buildings are a non-starter.
Do we have any on the web?
No, never got it.
Okay.
Thank you. This is Megan Boyd with Alston & Bird on behalf of several scrap metal recycling facilities. I wanted to echo some of Meg's comments, and in particular note that we have submitted some preliminary comments on these draft regulations, and particularly focused on the definitions. We view the definition of authorized metal shredder facility as overly broad, and would suggest that the good work of the department that was done in the draft report, that some of those definitions actually be incorporated into these regulations that would allow for would clarify and more precisely define what is metal shredder aggregate versus what is metal shredder residue. As drafted, I think I agree with Meg, it appears that the regulations apply to any metal shredder facility regardless of whether they treat metal shredder residue. When you read the report, there is a firm distinction And there has been for a long time in California, as best I can tell, a firm distinction between metal shredder aggregate and how that can be handled, and metal shredder residue and how that might be handled. And we would suggest that that distinction be codified in these regulations, and we have suggested some clarifications along those lines.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm Bob Hoffman, and I represent SA Recycling, which is a Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, and some points east recycling company. And something that's really important to us is that you're relying on this draft report that you guys issued. And there were substantial comments submitted on the draft report. And to the best of our knowledge, you haven't made any changes to the draft report in response to the comments, and you haven't responded to the comments. So basically, the basis for this proposed rulemaking is a draft report that has numerous inaccuracies and problems. So SA Recycling is requesting that you do respond to the comments on the draft report before you proceed further with the rulemaking. Otherwise, the record for the rulemaking is defective. So we understand that you want to move the regulations forward, but that the evidence that you're relying on for some of the conclusions that are represented in the proposed rulemaking are faulty. And unless you actually go through the exercise of evaluating each comment and responding to them, at least internally, you're not going to have a full appreciation of where your rulemaking is built on faulty premises. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two. There seems to be, and this is piggybacking on Meg's point to a certain extent. The slides and the background document that you prepared for today's workshop reference hammer mill shredders. There are other types of shredders, and although the regulations don't specify hammer mill shredders, it appears that your focus is on hammer mill shredders. We have to know that because we're obviously going to oppose that if that's the premise. But when you can't answer the question, can't tell us what the scope of the regulations is intended to be. It's a fundamental clarity issue from the perspective of the government code, which governs the rulemaking.
So this would apply to all three the SA facilities, right? Those would all be hammer mill, right?
Well, yes. Did you have a point in asking that question?
Well, which ones aren't hammer mill? That's really my question. Which ones of Sims, Schnitzer, SA, and Ecology?
Well, that's illuminating because if that's what you think the universe of the shredders is, then you're not aware of even some of the shredders that are represented in this room.
And Universal and Kramer. I mean, get the information to us. We can use it. So if you have information that would be helpful to us, we'd like to see it.
Okay, but you do get that it's a fundamental ambiguity in the way the regs are drafted.
Bob, that's a good question. Could you frame it and what changes you want to do to the regs and how we can make sure we clarify that?
Well, you could, yeah, you could clarify it by specifying, hammer mill shredders. There are, I forget the terminology for the other types of shredders. Most of them are mobile shredders. But you could specify a litany and say other shredding techniques that tear, disassemble, et cetera. And you could address it in the initial statement of reasons, right, which is the rulemaking record for what will ultimately be the draft regulations. And we'll address that in our informal comments as well as, in response to whatever you do put out for formal comment. Okay?
Thank you.
Statute uses the term shredding technique.
Mm-hmm.
There can be a hammer mill or any other method, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
guillotine, shear,
Mm-hmm.
etc. Speak into the record.
Meg, none of your comments are taken unless you speak to the mic.
Okay. So it's, the point I was making is, I believe, I don't have the statute in front of me, but I believe that the definition of metal shredding facility in SB 1249 is one which refers to a facility that uses a quote-unquote shredding technique without specific reference to what
Hammer
that
mill.
technique is.
Again, if the smaller facilities or the more obscure processes, I don't know that they would be attempting to utilize this exclusion. I don't know that they would be attempting to do the chemical treatment. That would be something of interest to us as well.
Well, it's a broader issue than that. I mean, I know this workshop is about, about these regulations, but you've embedded this concept of an authorized metal shredding facility in these draft regulations. That is highly problematic from our standpoint to condition what has been a declassification for the last 35 years on a brand new permit requirement, the scope of which we strongly dispute. And to the point of the speaker over here, if the permit process that we're talking about is one that applies to the treatment operation, the treatment facility for the shredder residue itself, and not to the removal of metals from the aggregate material, that's one thing. But if you've sort of conflated some very fundamental principles into this draft regulation that open up the discussion in a way that, there's a need for answers here.
Good, it's a good point.
Thank you.
So to further Meg's point, when you were going through the slide, specifically the slide on the current authority for residue disposal, you said that the scope of the rulemaking was only on the area within the dotted red box. And, that's just fundamentally untrue, Ed, because you've premised it on there being a permit. And it's obvious that you have some intention to expand the permit requirement beyond the scope of the treatment process. So in effect, in overturning the OPP document policy that's been in place since the 80s, you're engaging in a rulemaking by virtue of including that permit requirement. And it's disingenuous, and it's not transparent. And what Meg's point was, just to put an exclamation point on it, is that it creates an incredibly unlevel playing field if you're going to require permits for the processing of aggregate by virtue of managing the waste, and then facilities that are either illegally disposing of their shredder residue or shipping it out of state, not on a manifest, are getting an even further competitive disadvantage beyond simply the lack of enforcement. So you have to be straight up about it. You have to address the issue of the scope of this permit that you're anticipating requiring in this rulemaking. You cannot just pretend that somehow there's an existing permit requirement when that's not the baseline. So it's just got to be dealt with straight up. We can't sidestep it. Okay. Let me just take another look here. Meg addressed the issue of the transportation that's been addressed, and that's a significant issue from the perspective of the necessity for requiring it to be transported by the generator or by a registered hauler. That's a significant additional cost, and there is no evidence that the industry is aware of any incidents with respect to transportation that's been happening for decades. With respect to your proposed section 66261.4 I8, where you propose to limit the disposal to authorized solid waste facilities, I would direct you back to the statute. The statute focuses on facilities that have waste discharge requirements, and that was intentional. That the statute was carefully negotiated. 25150.82J says the disposal of, is it J? In any event, I don't know if it's J. Huh? Yeah. Sorry. It's J, 2, A, and B, all right, in the Health and Safety Code. And it says that this material may be used at a unit described in subparagraph B, this is A, as alternative daily cover or for beneficial uses pursuant to 4178.1.3 of the Public Resources Code, which you've included. But B goes on to say it may be placed in a unit that meets the waste discharge requirements issued pursuant to Division 7 of the Water Code that allow for discharges of designated waste as defined in Section 13173 of the Water Code, or of treated metal shredder waste. You are unnecessarily limiting the kinds of facilities. Again, that will change existing practices. We're not aware that there's been any study or understanding of existing practices outside the scope of permitted solid waste facilities, let alone any identification of problematic issues, okay? So to proceed to eliminate current options will impact both the shredder facilities as well as the receiving facilities, and you have to address that with some analysis other than, gee, it's more conservative, or we think those facilities have better controls. You have to actually look at what the problem is with what's going on currently and address it straight up. And look at the environmental impacts of that. Greenhouse gases have been mentioned, but I don't think they've been emphasized enough. Some of the repercussions of this proposal will be significant greenhouse gas increases.
Maureen? Not quite finished, Bob?
I think that's enough for today.
Don't forget, there's still a 30-day comment period that you can submit your questions or comments. Ms. Maureen?
No, I just, I agree that there's a lot of lack of clarity in the terms, but it really did seem like just a drafting problem or a drafting challenge. And I think a lot of the definitions in your report, if they were carefully scoped and replaced, that the regs are headed in the right direction. There are this lack of clarity, but I do think they're fixable. And our comments were attempting to provide that scope that everybody seems to be, well, what does it mean? It seems overbroad, but I do think it is fixable, and I think we've proposed some language that will help alleviate a lot of the concerns raised. And there's a lot of concerns raised that we didn't address, but I think they're also fixable. So don't despair.
Maureen, could I ask you to expand? You represent a kind of a different class or category of facility than most of the ones that we hear and deal with every day. Can you talk about your perspective and your client's perspective and how that may or may not be different and how these efforts may or may not apply?
Well, I'm just looking at the regs and what they say they want to do, and I also know I may have started this problem by saying the F letter should be rescinded.
Somebody
10
wrote
years
a
ago.
letter. That was
sorry.
September 29th, 2008.
I'm sorry. I may have started this problem, and that's why I'm here to help solve the problem. I understand the need to get off the F letters, right? And to make sure that the treated residue is handled properly, right? And to move to a regulatory solution as opposed to the F letter solution. And I think that the essence of that is in the regs, and it's all good. It needs to be refined to clarify a lot of these, if you read it this way or that way, it could create all these horrible unintended results. But I think it can be tightened up. But then there's this other issue, which is, more the question you're asking me is you're kind of capturing a lot of the upstream activities that are very useful for recovering scrap value. And that just has to do with terms in the English language and just using those terms very precisely to make sure that the upstream aggregate recovering the valuable scrap metal is distinct from the what are you doing with the residue issue. And I think it's imminently fixable, and the draft report and even some of your diagrams and your slides, if we could memorialize that in really clear English, would resolve a lot of these issues. So I think it's fixable. We've proposed some ideas for language to clarify and reduce the level of concern and problems, and we're happy to work with you to continue to do that.
Good.
Fantastic.
So I very much appreciate Maureen's comments that the department should distinguish between aggregate and metal shredder residue, as that term has historically been understood. And our position has always been that the aggregate materials are in process. That is where the value is. That scrap metal exemption applies to the in-feed as well as to those materials while they are being recycled. So we do not believe that there is a need or a legal basis for the permit requirement for the entire facility. So as to these draft regulations, which is the subject of the workshop, a suggestion is, well, two suggestions. One is that the piggybacking of the conditional exclusion onto the receipt of a authorization from the department for the facility as a whole, that requirement should be deleted, just simply deleted, or alternatively, these regulations should just be put on ice until we resolve the extent of the department's jurisdiction over the balance of the facilities. Because otherwise, if this regulation goes forward as it's currently structured, we're going to be in a big mess. That's all I can say.
Thanks, Maureen and Meg. So we'll go back and clarify the language, absolutely. We'll do that. I'm not sure we're going to put it on ice, but we'll take your comment though.
Anybody else? Oh, the web.
Got one comment through the mailbox. I apologize if I mispronounced the name. It's from Giovanni Leon. So to whom it may concern, isn't it unfair to allow shredders to dispose of waste when it fails the same standards everyone else has to uphold? If it fails both TTLC and STLC, how can we call it non-hazardous? And that's the end of their comment.
Okay, good.
Thank you, whoever out there on the web. Anybody else? We appreciate you guys being here, appreciate your comments, your suggestions, your feedback. So you don't have anything else?
Just again, 30 days, get your stuff in, sooner the better. And these are important comments. These are comments that we need to hear and understand and see. So thank you in advance.
Hey, Ed, do you have a date for another workshop?
I can't announce a date yet. We don't have anything publicized yet. I do want to encourage everybody, please make sure you're signed up to our listserv so that you're alerted to these things. And stay tuned. We'll be doing a lot of things in the near future.
We will have workshops on the report itself and the outcome of that report based on the comments you see. So sometime this summer we will have some workshops to follow up on the draft report itself, and hopefully we can answer a lot of the questions that you posed today through that process as well.
The dates for those workshops haven't been set either?
We have internal dates, but we have not firmed it up yet.
Thanks.